Welcome to Amazing Stories. Here, we take an in-depth look at the stories that have shaped humanity, always with a documentary, ethical, and rigorous approach. We neither celebrate nor justify. We analyze and seek to understand the events that transformed societies and shook nations. Today, we travel back in time to delve into the life of a man whose influence left an indelible mark on Mexico's recent history. His name still echoes in official reports, journalistic chronicles, and testimonies that have withstood the test of time. He was known as the boss of bosses, not by chance, but because he built a structure that operated like a true business machine for crime. This is the story of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the architect of the first great organized crime empire in Mexico. In the depths of organized crime in Mexico, only one name rises above all others, resonating as both a legend and an echo of terror. There was a time, before the fragmentation and unleashed violence, when a single man orchestrated the macabre symphony of drug trafficking, keeping every boss under his iron fist. It was from this, among other things, that Chapo Guzman became known for what he is today, controlling every route, every shipment, every illicit dollar that crossed the border. His word was law, his control absolute. He was the mastermind behind the first and only great unified drug empire, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the true boss of bosses. Get ready to dive deep into the story of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, the man who changed the rules of the game in Mexico and left an indelible mark on organized crime. During the darkest decades of criminal history in Mexico, one name was spoken with respect, fear, and admiration in organized crime circles: Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. Born on January 8, 1946, in Bella Vista, a small township of Culiacancito near Culiacan, Sinaloa, this man would go from being a state agent to becoming the main architect of illicit substance trafficking to the United States. He earned the unofficial title of drug czar and, for many, the undisputed boss of bosses. Félix Gallardo was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth. His rise began quietly within legal institutions. He trained as an agent in a then-powerful state judicial police, an agency that, more than a justice body, was a complex network of loyalties, deals, and favors, where he learned to move with discretion. But his first big step didn't come from an operation, but from politics. He became the personal bodyguard of the then-governor of Sinaloa, Leopoldo Sánchez Silas, a man of influence whose connections reached far beyond the state government. They say Félix Gallardo didn't talk much, but he listened to everything. His closeness to the governor wasn't just professional, it became personal. He became the godfather of the governor's son and, according to various investigations, received political protection during his first clandestine ventures, which at the time seemed like institutional loyalty. Soon, this would become the perfect shield to build a criminal empire. It was in the early 1980s when Félix Gallardo made his master move. Together with Rafael Caro Quintero and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, he founded an unprecedented criminal organization, the so-called Guadalajara Group, which would later become known as the Guadalajara Cartel. Unlike previous groups, which were disorganized and local, this collective operated like a corporation, a hierarchical structure, control of routes, use of rudimentary technology for the time, and above all, strategic alliances with the Colombian cartels, who were the main producers of illicit substances at that time. One of Félix Gallardo's smartest and most ambitious moves was to accept the bridge offered by Ramon Mata Ballesteros, a Honduran figure who acted as a link between the southern continent's cartels and the groups in the north. This is how Felix Gallardo forged ties with Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria and Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, legends of the illegal trade in Colombia. Mexico became the main route for transporting goods from South America to the United States. With every kilo that crossed, a fortune was made. While his partners managed the plantations and internal routes, Felix Gallardo controlled the political, financial, and logistical channels. He was an educated man, always dressed in a suit, discreet in his movements. He wasn't into parties or scandals. He preferred private meetings, encrypted calls, and orders that left no trace. His style was far from the violent stereotype, which made him even more feared. His power lay in total control. But in that kingdom, the balance was fragile. In 1985, an event would mark the beginning of the downfall, the kidnapping and subsequent murder of the American agent Enrique Kiki Camarena, who was working undercover for the DEA and was very close to dismantling the group's operations. Although accounts of who gave the order vary, suspicion fell directly on the three founders of the criminal group, including Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. The murder unleashed a storm. International pressure on the Mexican government intensified like never before. Embassies protested, the DEA demanded results, and the United States threatened sanctions. Despite their political connections, the safety net began to fall apart. Caro Quintero was the first to fall. Then came Ernesto Fonseca. But Felix Gallardo, the mastermind behind the operation, managed to stay free for several more years, operating from the shadows with the precision of a chess player. Until April 8, 1989 arrived. That day, Mexican authorities, in coordination with U.S. agencies, managed to arrest Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo. His capture marked the end of an era, but also the beginning of a new wave of criminal fragmentation. What would come next was the birth of new clans. With the fall of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo in 1989, the balance of the Mexican criminal underworld shattered like glass struck at its weakest point. The man who for years had maintained a unified structure of illegal trafficking and well-negotiated routes with the Colombian clans was removed from the board. But his arrest was far from the end of the game. From his cell, the boss of bosses continued to give orders through hidden cell phones. Even behind bars, his word was still law. But that control didn't take long to fade. The lines of communication became vulnerable, and the decentralization of power that he himself helped build ended up being his final sentence as a dominant figure. His empire split into cells: the Tijuana clan, controlled by the Arellano Felix brothers; the Sinaloa group, led by figures who until then had been his subordinates, like Joaquin Guzman Lora, Hector Luis Palma Salazar, and Ismael El Mayo Zambada; the Juarez group, under the silent shadow of Amado Carrillo Fuentes; and the resurgence of the Gulf clan, led by Juan Nepomuceno Guerra. Each one took their piece of the pie, and the war for total control broke out soon after. The most ironic part is that many of these leaders had once been considered almost like family by Felix Gallardo. In a time when loyalty seemed like a sacred value, the old codes were broken one by one. Hector El Güero Palma, for example, was identified as one of those responsible for one of the deepest wounds in Felix Gallardo's life: the kidnapping and murder of the son of Governor Rodolfo Sanchez Siles, a young man with whom Gallardo had a godfather-like relationship. Some say that this act was a personal affront that unleashed irreconcilable resentments, and ultimately sealed the enmity between former allies. That criminal world, which during the 80s had operated under an almost business-like discipline, became chaotic. The rules changed. Respect for the boss of bosses became a nostalgic shadow, and now power belonged to whoever had the most firepower, the most territory, and the fewest scruples. Meanwhile, inside the high-security Altiplano prison, and later in the Puente Grande complex, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo began to live a life very different from his golden years. He was no longer the man who negotiated directly with Pablo Escobar and Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha through envoys like Ramon Mata Ballesteros. Nor was he the feared godfather of the border who decided which route the tons of white powder leaving Colombia would take north. Now he was just another inmate, although his name still echoed powerfully through the halls of organized crime. He was still a living legend. In 1997, Los Tigres del Norte dedicated a corrido to him that many interpret as a covert tribute, the boss of Basses. Although the band never confirmed that it was about him, the lyrics seemed to clearly refer to a man who had ruled the underworld with intelligence rather than violence, who had known how to build alliances, and who now watched his legacy from the distance of imprisonment. On the family side, his life was also marked by unexpected connections. His alleged relationship with Sandra Avila Beltran, known as the Queen of the Pacific, was always a source of speculation. Although he denied knowing her, genealogical coincidences raised suspicions. The same thing happened with the Arellano Felix brothers, whom he also denied being related to, even though his mother, Alicia Felix Zazareta, was a cousin of Gallardo himself. In the world of crime, families were bound not only by blood, but also by alliances, marriages, and betrayals. Curiously, it was a relationship between his youngest daughter, Maria Elvira, and a nephew of Hector Palma that ultimately put an end to the feud between the two clans. An unexpected plot twist worthy of a crime novel, where emotional bonds achieved what neither bullets nor threats could, a tacit truce. But the story of the drug czar wouldn't be complete without mentioning his human frailty. Starting in 2022, Mexican authorities confirmed the obvious. His health was deteriorating rapidly. Glaucoma, deafness, severe depression, lung problems, and multiple chronic conditions kept him in a vulnerable state. It was then that the government considered transferring him to house arrest. Even President Andrés Manuel López Obrador spoke publicly about the former criminal leader's critical condition. However, in a final twist of irony, the very technology meant to allow for his monitoring, a geolocation ankle bracelet, became the obstacle that prevented his release. The company providing the device ended its service contract, and, with no replacement available, the boss of Basses remained locked up in Puente Grande. There, in a corner of the prison, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo devoted himself to tending gardens. The pay was symbolic, 400 pesos a week. But for a man who once handled multi-million-dollar sums and international routes, gardening was more than just a way to pass the time. It was a way to connect with something simpler, perhaps more human, a quiet way to resist the darkness. In recent years, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo has become a shadow of his former self. His gaze, once calculating and piercing, now reflected the weight of decades of imprisonment and the scars of a life marked by power, betrayal, and decline. The man who once controlled air and sea routes, who spoke with the most feared kingpins in Latin America, and who bought the silence of high-ranking government officials with suitcases full of dollars, could now barely walk, spoke with difficulty, and survived among damp walls, surrounded by criminals who, for the most part, grew up hearing his name as a legend. His story became a silent warning within the world of organized crime. More than a few young kingpins mentioned him as a founding myth, like someone looking to the past in search of the roots of an empire that was torn apart by ambition, but also as a symbol of the inevitable, that all power, no matter how absolute it may seem, eventually fades away. In 2021, an interview from prison shook the country. Sitting in a wheelchair, thin, his voice barely audible, Félix Gallardo declared that he would never leave prison alive. I have no hearing, I have no sight, I have nothing. I only have a cane, he murmured to the camera. Behind those words was not just a sick man. There was also the echo of a brutal era when the clans were just beginning to build their dominance over Mexico. His partial release in 2022, under house arrest for humanitarian reasons, did not cause the shock it would have years earlier. The country had changed. Organized crime had mutated into even more violent, more fragmented forms. The new kingpins no longer needed intermediaries with Colombia. They produced their own chemical poison in hidden labs and didn't negotiate. They imposed their will. The old codes of Felix, silence, loyalty, respect for one's word, no longer existed. They had been replaced by social media, where golden guns, corridos tumbados, and live-streamed executions appeared. Felix Gallardo's return to the public eye was symbolic. He no longer had power or an army, but his name remained a living archive. In later interviews, he avoided talking about his former associates. He refused to judge the new leaders. He said he no longer understood that world. In his own way, it was a confession of defeat and also a reflection of the transformation of organized crime in Mexico, which went from being a business controlled by a few men in suits to a chaotic hydra of dozens of fragmented clans, faceless and soulless. Court records reveal that his fortune, once incalculable, practically vanished. Property seized, accounts frozen, allies either dead or on the run. His family lived for years under the shadow of his name, some in anonymity, others in exile. All that remained was barely the memory of a dynasty that could have been, and that, like all dynasties, collapsed under its own weight. What many people don't know is that during his imprisonment, Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo became an avid reader. He would spend hours poring over books on history, philosophy, and religion. Some guards said that he even wrote long letters to his grandchildren, trying to explain to them who he was, but also who he never wanted to be. He wasn't seeking forgiveness, they said, but understanding. A final narrative in which his life could be understood as something more than just a series of crimes and conspiracies. And in that contradiction, in that desire to be something beyond the kingpin, the strategist, the boss of bosses, the depth of a figure who left his mark on the history of organized crime in Mexico was revealed. Because Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo was not just a criminal. He was a man who, from his youth, understood power as a complex machine, with gears made of politics, business, fear, and silence. An architect of invisible networks who built an empire before Mexico even realized it had one in its grasp. Today, at nearly 80 years old, he spends his final days in the shadows, without spotlights, without bodyguards, without fortune. His body is hunched and his voice trembles, but his name still appears in court records, popular songs, and TV series. His legend, like all dark legends, refuses to die completely. And meanwhile, out on the streets, the new faces of crime have taken his place, perhaps unaware that the path they walk was paved by someone who, in his time, believed he could control everything, not knowing that this very path would inevitably lead him to loneliness, imprisonment, and oblivion. The story of Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo is not just that of a man who rose to power. It is also the story of a system that allowed his rise and, along with it, the growth of a machine that would end up consuming an entire country. Let us always remember that behind every statistic, every shipment, and every operation, there are victims, there are affected communities, and there are generations scarred by violence and impunity. Nothing built on suffering can stand without consequences. Here, we do not justify, glorify, or exalt. We report responsibly so that what could have been avoided does not happen again, because those who do not know their history are doomed to repeat it. Hope lies in our collective ability to learn from these painful lessons, to demand transparency and justice, and to build solid foundations for a society where peace and well-being are the norm. May the memory of these stories inspire us to protect future generations, ensuring that their path is not marked by the shadows of the past, but by the light of a fairer and safer future for everyone. Thank you for being here. If you enjoyed this, leave a like and I'll see you in the next amazing story.